Beatriz Cortez is a visual artist and cultural critic based in Los Angeles. Originally from El Salvador, she migrated to the United States in 1989 in a moment when her country of origin was going through one of the harshest periods within a long social and political conflict. The experience of migration has influenced Cortez's work, which in many cases emphasizes the dual reality of the experience of immigrants who live in a metropolis while simultaneously inhabiting the reality of their city of origin. The simultaneity and the superimposition of experiences and discourses is one of the keys that has helped me navigate her work. The layers of meaning start unfolding when different references dialogue with each other in her work. These references can lead us to specific moments in history as well as to our own childhood, creating a moment of encounter. Cortez's work bridges an experience of the past with the possibility of the future and articulates discourses that address and question colonialism while playing with technology and memory. The way she chooses materials in her installations and objects resonate deep inside us and transports us to our childhood while at the same time speaking of discourses of power. The narratives that encounter each other and collide in her body of work usually have play as a strategy. Arcades and mirrors, interactive pieces and installations enable us to enter and look back, sometimes to see ourselves, sometimes to look at the past in a critical way, but always giving us the opportunity to look ahead and imagine a different future. Beatriz Cortez has shown her work nationally in Los Angeles, San Francisco, Washington, D.C., and New York, and internationally in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Costa Rica. She holds a master's in fine arts from the California Institute of the Arts and a doctorate in Latin American literature from Arizona State University. She teaches in the Department of Central American Studies at California State University, Northridge, and it is my pleasure to present her tonight.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation and has given me the opportunity to stop for a moment and think about my work and my concerns as I make that work. In particular, I'd like to thank now Amelia and Nora for the invitation, Julia, for that presentation. Thank you so much, and all of you for being here. I'm going to read because I'm going to try not to take that long, but I'll stop once in a while and extend myself a little bit. In general terms, my work is about the memory of growing up in El Salvador, in the war, where I lived for 11 of the 12-year war, and for the first 19 years of my life. And my work is greatly impacted by my own history of migration, my own experiences as I moved first to Arizona and then to Los Angeles in 2000 via Detroit, where I was a professor for 1 year at Wayne State University. But my work is also about the experience of simultaneity, of living in two places at once, San Salvador and Los Angeles, existing in two or more but different versions of modernity, in two different cultural mind frames, moving back and forth within different technologies. And more importantly, my work is about the future. I build memory so I can imagine possible futures. Because of this, there are three concepts that are central to my work. Let's see if this works. Time, simultaneity, and movement. And I'm interested in how other issues such as race, class, migration, or gender intercept or cut through those concepts. Time has become such a central concept in my work, and looking back, it has been a constant in my thinking, sometimes consciously and sometimes not. For instance, I didn't know this then, but when I reconstructed my childhood bedroom that you see here, to make this video, my objective was to construct memory, to revisit a place that had been taken away from me, but also to talk about the passing of time and about the lushness of life in spite of my loss, life that continues moving forward. Once I had completed the piece, I was able to see that I had inserted there a couple of things from my present that could not possibly be in my past. My parrot's cage, he was born in 2004 when I already lived here in in LA, and images of Bishop Romero, whose image I couldn't have in El Salvador at the time because of the censorship. In other words, I had made an intervention in the chronological order of time. And I'm gonna pause for a moment so that we can see the video. When I built a sculpture with soil and seeds that was meant to honor the unknown dead who have been thrown like trash in war and in migration, I watered it every day until it became a garden. And I did not realize that I was honoring someone who was not there at the moment. That is, that I was already crossing barriers of time and space, and I was already playing with the concept of the untimely. I have built installations with books. Installations that were about the memory of living in the war, about censorship, about violence, about living in fear. And I began burning books and burying books, as people did with their own books during the war in El Salvador, so that they wouldn't become targets of violence. But I built those installations with the books that I have today in my library. I hid the books that I thought would be banned today if the war happened in our own context. And when I built an armor made of steel for Rufina Maya, a woman who was the only survivor of a massacre that happened in 1981 in El Mozote, in El Salvador, a day after I turned 10, I wanted to protect her in 1982 when she really needed the armor and I wasn't able to make her one. And I wanted to protect her memory even though she's no longer here, and her testimonies continue unfolding through YouTube today without my help. And so, the ability to intervene in the chronological order of time became important in my work. I'm interested in multiple conceptual understandings of time, new philosophical ideas, such as speculative realism, ideas about the posthuman, philosophies of extinction, invite us to consider the impositions of seeing humanism, liberalism, the Enlightenment as the only way, a colonial way to understand reason, and with it to understand time. So striving to find other alternatives, particularly ones that can coexist with a multicultural reality of my own experience as a Central American, as a Salvadoran artist, I have become interested in paying attention to other understandings of reason and other understandings of time, such as the Maya long and short counts of time, which are circular conceptual constructions of time and are multiple and simultaneous. And I became interested in finding possible ways in which multiple understandings of reason and time could be expressed through cultural production, through architecture, through sculpture. For instance, when I built a time machine, I was interested in simultaneity and in making the city of Los Angeles and the city of San Salvador with the same light. So I projected a video of Los Angeles viewed from Griffith Park on the exterior panel and I opened thousands of holes with different drill bits that allowed me to create a video with rudimentary technology for the night view of San Salvador in the interior space of the installation. I also began thinking about the different versions of technologies that are operating at once, and that are, as an immigrant, you have to move back and forth from those different versions of modernity, of technology, different contexts, different narratives, and you are really crossing through time. And I began making fortune teller machines. The first one that I made is the one that you see here. I made it in collaboration with a Caxiquel collective, an indigenous Maya collective from the town of Patsicía in Guatemala. We have been working together for years and on several projects, including a museum of memory that they built in the town of Patsicía. And I asked them what they wanted for the future, and I programmed their desires into the machine. When you press that button that you see there, you get a ticket that looks like a receipt that says, when the future comes, there will be no genocide, for example. And I realized that a lot of their desires were in the negative. When the future comes, we will not be humiliated. When the future comes, we will not be murdered. And I realized that a lot of their desires talked about the particular context and the precariousness of their experiences. For the next machine, I interviewed a group of immigrants, and I asked them to also give me their desires for the future. And that was a group of immigrants and also border crossers from here, that were the people that had come from Latin America here, or people who had gone back and forth from here to Latin America. And that box prints tickets that say things like, when the future comes, we will have met our relatives in person. This piece is currently on display at my show at the Vincent Price Art Museum, Nomad World. The fortune teller is based on the idea that words have power and that one can will the future into being. Following some of the proposals on nomadism by Italian philosopher Rosi, it poses an invitation to a collective becoming, to future collective nomadic subjectivities that are made possible in the present through language, through the use of the future perfect tense. As I was searching for philosophical possibilities out of traditional liberal thought, traditional humanism, queer theory gave me the possibility to explore a space of undefined subjectivities, a space of blurriness and undefinition that I found to be a perfect fit for the space of the immigrant. On the other hand, I became fascinated with the philosophers of the Lucian genealogy. That is, philosophers whose option was not a post-colonial option, because I was more interested in blurred identities and in movement. Spinoza, Deleuze, Haraway, Braidotti, Barat, Colebrook, Peter Osborne gave me options that made me excited, and I began to investigate their ideas through my work. This is one of the pieces that I made reading some of those works. One of the philosophers who has impacted my understanding of time, which has become so central to my work, is Peter Osborne, because he questions the concept of modernity as a way to establish a chronology and also as a universal narrative of modernity. He argues that the effort to establish a narrative about modernity towards progress, towards development, is also a colonial and homogenizing effort to erase diversity. So rather than a chronology, Osborne is interested in the exploration of different modernities coexisting simultaneously. So, thinking about this, I began rebuilding pinball machines from old abandoned playfield boards with both mechanical and Arduino technologies. And in order to do that, I volunteered, I went to work, and I went to spy on everyone at the Vintage Arcade Superstore that's on San Fernando Road in Glendale, and I became friends with Morris, who's the chief mechanic there, and I learned a lot. I began making machines that had one crumbling modernity underneath and at the same time a new version of modernity on top, both visible. It also was the result of my own memories. I remembered in the 1980s going to a place called Aladdin's World, of course, that had this Orientalism and colonial narrative already in its name, around the corner from my house. And I remember playing with a machine called Cleopatra that was made in the 70s here and that had already been considered obsolete here because in the 80s, pinball machines here had already double-decker slides and other things. And so then these machines were sent as a brand new shiny modernity to El Salvador when they already were obsolete here, and I became really interested in that. So the Beast is a machine with a circular logic, as you can see. The ball enters the space, and the space is coded with a language related to migration. It's a field marked by the obstacles of immigration, and as much as the person playing attempts to keep the ball in the field, it is eventually expelled or deported from the field. But the machine is there in Nomad World exhibition, ready for another try, and so the spectators continue to send the ball in and collaborate collectively in keeping the ball in the play field, one effort at a time. All the pieces in that installation are about simultaneous realities, about coexisting in two or more places at once. And so the jukebox plays soundscapes from Central America, sounds that allow us to go back in time, to move in space, to travel to another reality in spite of migratory impediments, in spite of borders, economic hardships, and other realities. I also want to say that this machine to me is very dear because it was a machine that was made by an immigrant from Guatemala. His name is Mauro Gonzalez. And I looked for somebody who had lived in Central America and had worked making jukeboxes in Central America that had migrated here and continued to do that, because I felt it's such a specialized field. I thought maybe I can find someone. And I was able to find him. He worked since he was 14 years old in Guatemala, and he used to go into the bars and into the restaurants to install jukeboxes with those 45s that had a different type of technology. So the mechanics of the, that hand that lifts the 45s and all that might be similar, but it was a little bit different. And he says that when he migrated to Los Angeles, that he had to go to school to learn how to work with the CDs, because this machine works with CDs. So he prepared the machine and he brought it over to the Vincent Price Art Museum and taught me how to program it. And then he left. And he said, "Are you sure you don't want me to program it with music? I have all this music." And I said, "Yeah, I'm sure," because I showed him what I was going to do. And so he was really excited to be part of this experience. I wasn't able to insert the sound, but I have some sound here. So let's interrupt this for a moment and see if we can find the sound. These are some examples of some of the sounds that are in that jukebox. However, when you're standing in front of the jukebox, you get to choose the sounds. And here we have them in a chronological order, which is exactly what I'm trying to break, but at least it will give us an idea of different things that are there. So we have the rain, we have my shop, we have the circus. But it's the circus being announced from a megaphone in the car next to mine. And this is the wind, which is me living by myself in El Salvador now that I don't live there, and hearing the sound of the wind moving the trees next to a window and scratching the window, and me being terrified. So these are the sounds. Let's see if we can jump. The parakeets means if you're from San Salvador that it's 6 p.m. and that the parrots are going to bed. So, let's see. Let's go back to where we were. And then there's a photo booth. And the photo booth began as a project for undocumented immigrants who are unable to go back home like everyone else and take selfies and photos in all kinds of places in Central America and Mexico and share them on social media. That is the virtual space that links together our divided families, our divided lives. So I wanted to make a photo booth for them to be able to do that as well. But seeing the public play with the photo booth has also brought me to realize that it not only can help us be in two places at once in East Los Angeles and in the street where I grew up in San Salvador, also called Los Angeles, or in Guatemala City, or in Antigua, Guatemala, or in Tegucigalpa, but also that it invited people to play. Art, like play, allows us to experiment with different ideas of space and time. We can jump through different moments in time, exist in different spaces at once, move around, be faster, be slower, and so forth. So I learned a lot from people. I have a feed in my Dropbox, so I have more than 800 photographs of all the people that go there. And I have learned a lot from people's imaginations, things that I never thought anyone would do. For example, move really fast so that they can be in different places in each one of the photographs, or for example, be in 4 places at once. So find a way to stack all the images so that they can be one part in different places but in the same photograph, and things like that. So it has become really interesting for me. The cosmos, in this case the spaceship that's part of the Cosmos installation. Let's keep moving on. Well, this installation to me was about several things. On the one hand, as I was saying, I was interested in, it's not that I'm not interested in identity, because I am, and I don't think that we're all the same and that there are no identities, of course, but I am interested in an identity that's constantly moving and not in an identity that's solidified and rigid and that we have to then treat as a territory that we have to protect and defend, but rather an identity that we're constantly reinventing, that is constantly unfolding. So this piece, the Cosmos, was about me thinking about my past, but also me thinking about the future in many different ways. On the one hand, I was interested in the idea that immigrants are not imagined in space travel, that space travel is usually imagined as an activity that only citizens do, for example. I was interested in the idea of fragmenting identities, and there are places where you could stand in front of this piece where you disappear, your image disappears, your reflection disappears, like the vampires, and there are ways in which you're contorted, there are ways in which you can see yourself fragmented in many pieces. So the Cosmos became also a metaphor for the future, but I was also reading Rosi Braidotti's The Posthuman, and I was interested in the 3rd chapter of that book, which talks about death as an ultimate way of becoming. And to me, that became really interesting, because to me that was the most anti-Spinozian thing that Braidotti had ever said, because Spinoza would always choose life and say that our body is the measure of our power to act, and that we have to protect our power to act, and that's our ability to become. And Braidotti was saying that death is a way to become, and that became a big problem in my head that I wanted to address. And so I began building this piece, and the idea that we could fragment ourselves, that we could imagine becoming other, that being an immigrant means that you can be here, but you can imagine becoming collectively with other people that are also here, another you, many versions of yourself. Imagine death as a future. That was interesting also to me, because it was a way to imagine death not as the terminal thing that had marked my years growing up in the war, but death as something that was not linked to trauma, but that was linked to becoming a future where we become cosmic dust. And I became interested in the way that light was moving at light speed in the gallery, and I became interested in the idea that I had a kaleidoscope installed in the gallery and an X on the floor, so that people could stand in that spot and they could see their image fragmented and moving through the gallery. And I became interested in how people played, and they contorted themselves and moved their arms because they liked how their fragmented image created all these kaleidoscopic images. And I was really interested in this installation and how it was fragmenting who we are. And also, also then I made this box, and this box is called the Untimely Conversation box, and that was the place where your image could be fragmented the most, I think. But it was one of the pieces that I felt could really unfold, because once you press that button, instead of receiving a fortune, what you could do is have a conversation with others who were not there, or others who are not alive at this moment, who were alive, at other times. So you could have a conversation with Spinoza, with Deleuze, with Bob Marley, with Roberto Bolaño, with Roque Dalton, and all of them were talking always about death and about the future, or about time warps. For example, Bob Marley's quote says, "In this great future, you can't forget your past." Or Karen Barad says, "Borders don't stand still." Or Rosi Braidotti says, "You can't be a nomad, but you can't keep trying to become one," etc. So it had all these different quotes. They're not signed, so you can know or not know whose they are, but you can continue that conversation, and that became an interesting thing to me, because it also meant that others who have not been born yet could have a conversation with us when we're dead, and that at the same time that that exhibition was talking about death, it was also talking about a life that extended beyond our human body. And then I went to Cerritos College. I had a residency there in the auto body shop, and there were many things that were interesting to me about that. I ended up building an installation that in many ways, I would say that it's an installation that's in conversation with the cosmos that you just saw, and it was titled Your Life's Work. But it was also about labor, and it was also about working in the auto body shop. It was, it included my reflections about time, about labor, about vocational school, particularly the Vocational Education Act of 1917, that in my mind brought together, it was in the middle also of the campaign for the primaries, and I remember on the one hand, I think it was Marco Rubio who said, "We don't need more philosophers, we need more welders." And I saw myself as a welding philosopher, and I thought, I don't know what I think about this. But at the same time, I saw Obama saying, we need to have the first 2 years of college be free So to me, Obama was saying the same thing. So I made a piece with those two sound bites, and I called it Mirror Image over here. And then I had a box that was an aptitude test box. And that one is Black Mirror. And then I had 3 videos that were based on some historic videos that were made in the middle of World War II by a man by the name of Arthur Toogood, who created these videos to convince people to go to vocational school instead of going to any other type of college so that they could create planes and weapons for the war. And I felt that the soundtrack of those videos was quite Foucauldian. It was about disciplining bodies. And I became interested in removing that soundtrack, which I chopped up and I placed inside that ball. And then I created speculative interventions in time, and I made a new soundtrack for those videos so that I imagine myself being the person designing the vocational education in the middle of the 20th century and imagining what our world would be now if I had actually done that. But in this case, the Black Mirror is this geodesic dome structure made with hexagons and pentagons that I curved in a stretcher and a shrinker machine with my foot. And I made everything by hand, even though it looks, usually people who fix dents in cars do things by hand. They look like a machine fixed a piece, but it's not the case. And so I followed that same process. It's all made with steel. It took me a lot of months. And I was able to build this large mirror that in my opinion, existed inside and outside modernity, or in different modernities, and evoked black obsidian mosaics and industrial constructions at once. In the label, I invited the viewer to consider this black mirror as a way to predict one's destiny, as Mesoamerican cultures in ancient times had considered such mosaic dark mirrors as portals to other worlds. But then you had the aptitude test box, the modern way of predicting our destiny. Here, you could only get predictions that came from the original videos from 1944. So when you press the button, it said things like, if you strive yourself, you might become the supervisor in a welding shop. Or if you don't mind the grease and the oil, you might be a good welder. If you are not afraid of heights, you could become an electrician. So things like that is what you get in this box, and I made it in such a way that the metal was not sealed, it was alive, and so when everybody touched it, and it began to rust while the black mirror continued to be this polished black. So I became interested in the possibility of making visible the many new and old circulating and recirculating types of modernities that are part of my realm, the obsolete modernities that become new, and more importantly, the way that being an immigrant forced me to move from one to another. Claire Colebrook talks about extinction, about a future after humans, a non-human geologist of the future that she imagines, and when I read it, imagine it as one of those rovers that are in Mars, who will read our mark on the planet. This non-human geologist of the future will read the sedimentation layers, will read the rocks and the stones for traces of the Anthropocene, for traces of the human. And reading her work on extinction, lava came back to my mind as a material that would confuse the geologists of the future and would blur the records, but more importantly, would break with the chronological order of time. The lava from the past, spit out by a volcano, changes the order of layers that write the temporal history of our passing through the earth. And this is how I began to explore different ways in which matter breaks chronology. And I built Cairn. This piece outside the Brand Library in Glendale was a mound of stone serving as a landmark. Indigenous peoples have built cairns for centuries to mark the way on a trail, to mark sacred ground, to mark burial ground, or as other forms of landmarks. But those are nomadic, so they don't have concrete. And if this is the way to travel during the summer, it might be moved somewhere else to travel during the winter. But at the turn of the 20th century in Los Angeles, this indigenous way of building with river rocks was often used to build craftsman and Spanish colonial revival homes in what came to be known as LA vernacular style of construction. And oftentimes, for example, as in the Stonehurst district in Sunland, there are cairns that mark where private property begins. And so I began to think about how cairns were placed, for example, between the border of Mexico and the United States. And to me, this was so clearly a Deleuzian situation. Either you are rigidly diagrammed by modernity, or you're moving through smooth space like the nomads and ignoring that rigid diagram. And so I became really interested in building these cairns in ways that, on the one hand, say we're here. The material, the lava, is a material that was really important to me because in El Salvador we had lava as a material that, behind the San Salvador volcano, it had erupted. We had black lava like that. But in the war, the lava was the place where the tortured bodies of the disappeared were thrown on the lava. So if you were looking for somebody that had disappeared in your family, you could go to the lava and look at all the dead and see if you could find them. And then you had to act like you didn't find them and then say, I didn't find them, because if you picked them up, you would be next. But the lava to me was a symbol of death. And I think that through this whole process, the lava also became this joke that the planet is playing on that future geologist that is trying really hard to read all the sedimentation layers, and the lava is breaking with them. And so I was really interested in that idea and the syncretism that it represented. I also have one right now on exhibition in Ecuador at the Centro Cultural Metropolitano in Quito. This piece to me was really important to place in Ecuador. This is lava from the Cotopaxi volcano in Ecuador, because that area is heavily populated with indigenous people, and to me it was really important to place this piece there where I knew that they would be able to recognize it, not as a sculpture but as another type of marker. And so this marcador is made in a similar way, and it makes invisible the lava that connects our continent. Well, finally, I want to finish up by discussing a little bit about the work that I'm building today. On the one hand, I'm working on the construction of an installation titled the Memory Insertion Capsule for Mundos Alternos, Art and Science Fiction in the Americas, a show that is going to be part of Pacific Standard Time in UC Riverside, in the UC Art Block. This piece has a complicated history, and here you're only seeing one small section of the piece, which is the fireplace. On the one hand, my interest in stones, as I was saying, and in that syncretic construction that became LA vernacular, but also in the greater lifetime that stones have in the long count of time in comparison to humans, in the ways that object-oriented ontologies or the O ideas must have made me pay attention to the work of a great master. But the truth is not even that. A friend of mine asked me, can you go with me to see if I should rent a house or not, because I don't know the valley? And I said yes. And I was like, Sunlight and Sheldon, I have never been there, blah, blah, blah. And I went there, and I fell in love immediately with that place where I go all the time, because I realized that the man who had built that house was the greatest master that I had ever seen build anything with rocks. And I began finding out everything about him. His name is Dan Montelongo. So I found Dan Montelongo, and I began to realize that he had more than 90 houses there in Sunland, but that he had built houses in San Fernando, in Silmar, in La Crescenta, in Pasadena, in other places. And his indigenous way of construction, his way of building those porch columns and fireplaces made me realize that what we call a lay vernacular is a syncretic style where ideas about craftsman constructions and ideas about indigenous stone constructions coexist with colonial ideas about plantation architecture. On the other hand, I have always been interested in deconstructing the ways in which indigenous cultural production is pushed to the imagined past and erased from our imagined futures. So I wanted to build a space capsule that invites the viewer to imagine indigenous aesthetics in our future. It has a river rock fireplace in its interior as well as rocks in its exterior. However, these are stones from another place or time. These are stones formed by sheet metal produced for industrial purposes and brought back to the earth and to exist as stones. These are rocks from elsewhere, rocks that could very well be remnants of industrialization, rocks from the future. But also this is a space capsule that digs the past out, like the volcanoes that spit the lava. So I have been hard at work at local archives trying to understand the history of eugenics in the city of Los Angeles, particularly in Pasadena, through my exploration of the history of the Human Betterment Foundation. Its secretary, Paul Popenoe, was the brother of Wilson Popenoe, the chief engineer of the United Fruit Company in Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, uniting in this way my two homes with a past of US intervention, racism, forced sterilization, genetic experimentation, and labor exploitation. These are the memories that viewers will have inserted into their brains when visiting the memory insertion capsule. And I need to make a brief detour before I finish and mention my friend Douglas Carranza. He is a Delusian cultural anthropologist, and when I met him in 2000, he was already completing his doctorate at UC Santa Barbara. He's now the chair of my department. He not only introduced me to Deleuze and Spinoza, which I really, really appreciate, but also filled some of the gaps that I had in the history of contemporary art in California. Gaps that were due to my time being undocumented, gaps due to the time when I became obsessed with understanding the war in El Salvador. He knew about the contemporary art world because when he first arrived to this country from his native Cojutepeque in El Salvador, he worked as a janitor at the Newport Harbor Art Museum in Orange County. As many immigrants do, they provide the labor that makes the art world possible, a labor that is often invisible and unrecognized. And so those stories about him, before being who he is now, cut through time and space and took me to a time when he was there chatting in the middle of the night with the artists, when he was a lone spectator at 1 a.m. on installations like The Tale of Two Cities by Chris Burden, or watching John Baldessari repeat, "I am making art, I am making art, I am making art," have always marked my understandings of contemporary art and the political and cultural spaces where it merges with immigration. I sometimes dream that I will one day be included in a show at OCMA so that I can place my work with the shared visions of that same immigrant in those same galleries that he used to maintain, so I can complete that circle. The good news is that I have been invited to the final show that OCMA will hold at that very museum, the California Pacific Triennial, in 2017, curated by Cassandra Koblenz. And I'm lucky because they're selling that building, so that's my last opportunity to do that. And I am currently building a large format installation called the Lakota Porch. And you see here, this is a photograph of that Lakota porch made by Dan Montelongo in 1917 or 1914, and still standing there. Located inside and outside the home, the porch is both public and private. As part of the Los Angeles Craftsman Vernacular movement, the porch exists both inside and outside modernity. Its craftsman dimension meant that it was built with handcrafted details as a way to resist industrialization and to bring beauty to daily life. It was linked to the back to the land philosophy that encouraged the construction of buildings with local materials And it also exhibited an ancient indigenous way of construction with rocks, evoking the foundations of the Templo Mayor built by the Aztecs, the Mayan pyramids, the Inca temples, or the Inca aqueduct spirals in Nazca, among others. While porches are often represented as part of a homogeneous American tradition, they have multicultural legacies that relate both to the history of slavery and slave labor in the construction of emerging towns and urban spaces, and also to a history of colonization in the United States and the Americas. It is a complex symbol. It can at once represent a space of cultural coexistence in contemporary California and colonial legacy. It represents a history of resistance to industrialization and a history of privilege. It opens a space for community interaction, but also isolates the home as a space for privilege, marking the porch as the last accessible space for those foreign, undeserving, undesired bodies not belonging in the interior of the home. It's a piece about time warps, about gentrification, that replicates the porch of one of Dan Montelongo's constructions, but this time made with industrial sheet metal, like a construction of a future without wood, without rocks, but a future with nostalgia for those materials, and at once a past of a beautiful home that was once built for the elites of the city of San Fernando, but that through the circular passing of 100 years came to be the home of a Lakota woman who enjoys on a daily basis the construction of an Apache man. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, it's up to you. Yes, sure. Yeah, so I think we have time for a conversation, and I would be very interested in your comments and questions.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm from Ecuador, and I was wondering if the indigenous people that live in the Cotopaxi ever commented on your piece, or were they?
Well, I didn't go ask a specific group of people, but while I was there, because I was there for about 10 days in Ecuador, several people came to the gallery and talked to me about how they had similar constructions. Somebody told me that they had constructed several of these because they wanted to raise crabs, and I guess that was a way for crabs to reproduce, and so they liked seafood, and they were coming from the coast. And so it depended on who came. They gave me a different story about why they built these things. But to me, it was really important, for instance, not to call it a sculpture, but to leave it open so that people could come and see whatever it was that they saw. So I heard a lot of different versions of how people interpreted the piece. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah?
Who are some artists that you're looking at in the LA area as far as performers, sculptors, writers?
Well, there are so many artists that I'm looking at in the LA area. I think that depending on what it is that I'm doing, I am really excited about different things. For example, in terms of construction of these stone porches and fireplaces, I'm interested in the adobe bricks that Rafa Esparza is making. But in terms of the idea of indigenous people living in the future, for example, I'm interested in the soldaderas that now built and that had armor. And I was always interested in the idea that I had built an armor, that she had built an armor, and that we were empowering that representation of these people that have been erased from history. I am interested in the way that Carmen Argote is looking at the constructions of houses that do not exist. But I'm also really interested in, for example, Luis Hawk, who's working in San Diego. He's building these walls that are made with those boxes that the farm workers use to pack the strawberries and tomatoes and other things, those corrugated cardboard. And I understand that he's bringing that piece here to LA in January. So I'm looking at different artists that are thinking about labor, immigration, architecture, and also this idea of these materials that are breaking the chronological order of time. So I also have some friends that I think that became interested along with me in some of these things. So for example, Paul Rosero, who's from Ecuador, he and I went to school together, and we have been really interested in similar things. Kyle Johansson, he's now working in Chicago, but I think the three of us were thinking about similar ideas about speculative realities, or opening a black hole, or a time warp, or a time worm. And I think that in many ways we have been reading similar things as well. And I think that also one is impacted by other artists. My life is very transnational, so I'm also interested in what many artists are doing in Central America, and I teach about their work, so I'm always on top of what they're doing, sometimes even more than what the artists are doing in Los Angeles, believe it or not, because I'm constantly talking to them. So there are artists that are, I think, working with speculative realities in ways that are really interesting to me, like Mayra Barraza, who is a painter, and she is building these paintings that look like a weaving from a basket and bring together 4 different realities into one center where they're interwoven. Or Simone Vega, who's building spaceships with recycled materials. And while I might not be such a fan of the name tropical that he very much likes to use, I am a great fan of his structures and of his work. So I think that his work has impacted me and my work tremendously. And then there are other artists like Ronald Moran, who's building stairways and buildings with thread. And because of that, those exist and don't exist at the same time in the place where you see them. And because they don't exist, it's kind of like those Jeffrey Valance pieces where he calls a medium, and the medium tells you what Van Gogh would say right now. And you know that on the one hand, I guess I know that I'm not so convinced that this medium is talking to Van Gogh, so I sometimes think maybe he's talking about what he learned about Van Gogh and what he thinks about Van Gogh. And I think that there's something about Ronald Moran building those imaginary buildings with thread that is kind of like a confession of how he imagines the buildings should be, how he imagines that a great structure should have all these stairways, how he imagines all these things that to me is fascinating. So there are all these artists that really have impacted my work in different places, and I think that's part of what's interesting in terms of having those conversations with them. And I think that slowly we have become really interested in showing our work together and talking about our work all the time.
A lot of your work surrounds creating different worlds, and in LA vernacular mentions Drop City in Colorado. I just wondered if there was any other utopic living systems that you've researched or are quite inspired by that have hope to sustain in the future.
Yeah, I think that Drop City, I was really actually interested in Buckminster Fuller's geodesic domes. On the one hand, I'm kind of mad at him because I think that he shouldn't have a patent on a structure that I see in the Pantheon in Rome and that I see in Chichen Itza in Yucatan, and I think, how is this possible? These are like monuments to humanity, and they gave him the patents. I can't believe it. And on the other hand, I am fascinated by the ways in which he is building these structures that are, in so many ways, he gets these patents, and then he decides in 1966, I'm going to give it to everybody, and I'm going to publish it in Scientific American, and I'm going to just let everybody have it. And so Drop City is kind of like that, one of those experiments. But I was asking a lot of my friends who are over 70 if they remembered, and a lot of them tell me, oh yeah, I remember there was a time when everybody built those, and then the plastic would fall on people's heads, and they were not really good at building them. And so I was really interested in this frenzy of building these geodesic domes, because it's not easy to build a geodesic dome. And I was interested also in the idea that Buckminster Fuller, in his days in Los Angeles, living in Pacific Palisades, and that he had a lot of students here, and that there was a city that was built for as a homeless shelter by one of his students, and that later on was sold on eBay in 2004 or 2005, something like that. So I became interested in these many different lives that ended up coexisting here in Los Angeles, I guess. And so I am interested in how going to visit the local archives allows us to see some of these things come back to life.
Okay, sorry. Thanks for that lecture. It was really great. And I had a question for you. You at one point said that it was, philosophy on one hand, the object-oriented ontology, and the Deleuzian and Spinozan philosophy that came into your work, but also queer theory. And you talked quite a bit about the object-oriented ontology, and I'm wondering kind of what you took from queer theory into your work. Because one of the things that I've been sometimes frustrated with queer theory is that there's not oftentimes a direct address of the kind of kind of immigrant identities and how those could be actually quite parallel to a lot of the concerns of queer theory. Besides someone like Carlos Montler or something else, so I'm interested in kind of how you kind of take from queer theory and kind of put that in your work.
Yeah, I think I went to grad school when I studied literature. Before Munoz, before other queer theorists, so in reality, it was true that one could very much question queer identities the way that they were being discussed for their lack of diversity, and also for constructing a certain kind of understanding of queerness that at the time, I remember there was an article in the Material Queer that Judith Butler wrote that I remember I loved, because she said, the lesbian identity is like getting into another closet, and I have to perform that identity. And that was one of my favorite articles that she wrote. But I was lucky. I went to a school, Spanish departments can be very conservative, and I ended up going to a school that was very much queer studies Spanish department under the direction of David Foster. And so there were 78 TAs and 76 people were studying queer theory, and I became fascinated with the possibility of reading queer theory to apply it to race and to apply it to immigration, and to think about how connected they were, but also to think about the experience of the border and the experience of immigration. So I think that even if the theorists don't do it, we can do it. So I don't really accept, I've heard people say, oh, why do you want to read Deleuze? He's a French, European, Eurocentric, white male philosopher. Deleuze is dead, I am interested in having a conversation with his work, and I have the right to have a conversation with his work and to apply it to whatever I want. And that's what I was doing there. So there's something kind of interesting about like being disrespectful with the original intent of a text, because after all, like Paul Brooks says in that beautiful book about Walter Benjamin and the man, I think is Theories of the Disappearing Future, she says context is not what we're looking for, the original intention is not what we're looking for, because that works as an identity. Then it doesn't matter what I'm reading into this text, but what the original intention of that man who's dead was. And she's not interested in that. She's interested in reading this as if the humans that it was meant to be written for don't exist yet, she says. And I think there's something beautiful about doing that with everything. So I think that in many ways, my first approach to queer theory was trying to deal with nationalism and national identity, and the way that many immigrants, because they felt nostalgic for their home, became very nationalistic here. And I didn't want that, and I felt that because I have so many indigenous friends, nationalism is so violent towards them, that I wanted the opposite of nationalism always. And that gave me a space of an undefined small territory to survive, and I think that's basically how I began thinking about those things. And you're welcome. Yes?
Wouldn't you say that your work is a tribute to your country as well? So how, like, at least sometimes when I feel like something's not right in the States, I miss Ecuador, but how can you avoid, how do you balance like missing a country and like representing that nostalgia and not become like a nationalist?
I don't think that my work is a tribute to a country, because a country is a cultural construction, is a political construction that is, for the most part, linked to a territory. And so it functions like identities, that it's this very, we have to follow what the state and its agents define that country to be. I think that my work is a monument to my own memories and my own experience as a transnational being, and that my own idea of that homeland and the idea of growing up in that space and that landscape is there, but not in the way that the state would like to understand it. I don't know if I explain myself. So for example, when I was in Ecuador, I was really surprised, for example, to give you an example, that a president that's seen as progressive from the left, etc., had this performance every Monday of the change of guard, where everyone is dressed as, how do you say, soldadito de plomo, like those toy soldiers, you know, that everyone on a horse, and this whole display of monarchic powers. That I don't think that I want to make an homage to, but there's something about growing up in my home and being who I am and eating what I eat and the materiality of the things that I saw, like for example, reconstructing my bedroom in the way that I remember it. So I remember the ceiling tiles being made of plywood, and I remember seeing all these things in the plywood. Like all those things, I think that those are important and concrete, that are also abstract enough that we can interpret in many different ways. So I don't know if that's clear, but it's, yes. Did you have a comment?
Me?
Yes.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about the role of nostalgia in your work, but I think I got my answer maybe from this question a bit.
Well,
yeah, because I wanted to ask you maybe as like an artistic approach or like a tactic, or what do you expect to get from the spectator, because obviously you're the spectator, and I don't know, you were just talking about something very specific as your very specific past and history, and nostalgia is always for like the homeland, this is the origin, but the jukebox or this pinball machine, I think it's something more culturally wide, but it does arouse this nostalgic, so.
well, I I think it's a really good question, because nostalgia has always been and also the construction of memory has been a big problem, not only in my artwork, but also in my writings. Basically, I even found a huge crisis, I think, at a certain moment when I realized that, because I had this commitment, especially as a critic, to write about, to contribute to the construction of historic memory, because I don't like the official history that El Salvador has written, which is about forgetting, basically. And at the same time, I realized that building memory, one has to be careful, because it's very much like building identity. It builds the foundations for a certain identity, and I realized that I was doing the opposite of what I intended to do. And it paralyzed me for a while, and I was in crisis, and this was not very long ago. This was like 2015, February, let's say. And I was like, what am I doing? I was almost done with the book. I have to rewrite this book, and I have to redo all these things. But I think that I have come to understand that when you use memories in a very concrete way, but that are abstract enough that others can enter those memories and assign other meanings, then you are constructing memories as if the humans that were meant to see those memories don't exist yet. So for example, when you listen to the jukebox, I heard all these people say, oh, this sounds just like Vancouver. I am from Vancouver, and that's how it sounds. And I was like, okay. And because in reality, everyone has their own, I don't know, baggage to relate to the world. So I think that the way I solved the issue about memory and nostalgia was that I was trying to build a memory for the future and not for the solidifying a past, but that is something that I have to tackle every time that I make a piece. And I don't know that I have been able to solve that, and maybe that's the problem of my life. I don't know if I will solve it, but I do worry about that every time I make a piece, and I worry a lot.
Thank you.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. It's like that, my Achilles. ¿Cómo se llama? Heel. Anyway, yes, no.
Thanks for your talk. It's been wonderful. I've been thinking a lot about sort of the popularity of DNA testing, and I was wondering if you were thinking about that. And you know, I thought it was really useful to think about this idea of the identity in transit rather than a kind of fluid identity, the way that, you know, people approach identity. And some will say, well, identity is fluid, but then I think the idea of identity being in transit might be kind of more to the point. And so I was sort of imagining all these people getting DNA tests and sort of having this sort of crisis of identity. You know, because I've heard several stories about people having these tests and then having a kind of crisis of identity, thinking that they were sort of anchored in this one kind of tradition or identity or nationalist or ethnic identity that they felt related to because it was part of who they were growing up, and then they found out they weren't part of that identity, and they had been telling the story to themselves and other people all this time, and then, you know, they found out, well, it wasn't necessarily true in that sort of DNA kind of way. And so I was just wondering if you had, you know, been thinking about this DNA testing.
Well, yes and no.
Okay.
Well, I'm a little bit worried about, because I spent all this time at the archives, for example, the Caltech archives, reading about eugenics and all this stuff, and so I worry that DNA testing kind of brings us back to this classifying of humans in ways that I'm not sure that I feel comfortable with, but at the same time, as I'm hearing you talk, I also think that we create a certain kind of DNA blueprint of other kinds that is not genetic, but is still genetic, so anyway, even if you deny it, we're still doing it. So for example, we create our points of reference. We create the things that we hold on to as the points that we use as a reference to imagine our identities, and even though we have those identities that are in transition, I think that also we have points of reference that we think they're unmovable. So for example, Dan Montelongo for me became this really important point of reference, and so then I began reading all the archives about him and going to visit every one of his houses obsessively, and then I went to the cemetery to look for his grave, and nobody could find his grave, and they still haven't been able to find his grave, but it's that cemetery that all these crooks built by the Burbank Airport, so you don't even know if maybe they resolved his plot, so I keep telling them, you have to find it, and they're like, what do you care, he died in 1955, you were not alive, and I'm like, no, I love this man, you have to find him. So then I make them keep looking, but they don't find him, because I know exactly where he should be, and he's not there. So then I read one day that Dan Montelongo said, that he would never allow Mexicans to speak Spanish. And then I was like, you know, it's like getting your DNA test.
Yeah, and finding out, yeah.
Yeah, it's similar. It's like, okay, we keep building this, but we have to let go at least. This is not DNA, so I can let it go. I don't know how to handle the unmovable, which is a lot, you know, so our biological material, so I don't know if I can do that, but maybe one day I'll be brave.
Have you been to the Buckminster Fuller archives at Stanford?
No, I haven't, although they're all available online.
Okay.
Yeah, they're digitalized, so you can get all the plans and all the everything online, and you can write to them if you want to use it in your artwork, and they usually let you. Yeah. Any other questions?